Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx, to who is now joining us on Facebook, and to who will be watching later this video. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a side event to the 48th session of the Human Rights Council, organized within the framework of the Geneva Toxic-Free Talks and the Geneva Plastic Pollution Dialogues. The event is also co-sponsored by Ecuador and the European Union. For those who wouldn't know, let me just remind you that these Geneva Plastic Pollution Dialogues have kept the international community in Geneva engaged on this topic in the past months, making links with numerous processes in international Geneva to tackle plastic pollution and with the United Nations Environmental Assembly. These dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in partnership with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, the International Union for Nature Conservation, Norway, Switzerland, and the Forum on Trade, Environment, and Sustainable Development Goals. To guide you through this event today, you will have the pleasure, you have already heard David Azoulay. David Azoulay is the Director of the Health and Environment Program at Ciel, and he will also introduce himself. So with that, David, as we are already running a few minutes late, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Diana. Hello, everyone, colleagues and others. Welcome. I'm very excited to be facilitating this event and this conversation. We'll be hearing first a number of introductory remarks from a number of ambassadors. Unfortunately, both the ambassador of the EU and the ambassador of Ecuador were not able to join us today, so they will be sharing a recorded message. We will then hear from the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Dr. Orellana, who will introduce us, present the report that will be presented to the General Assembly in a month from now. We'll then hear from Mr. Hemanta Wintanaj, who's the Senior Advisor for the Center for Environmental Justice and chairperson of Friends of the Earth International, and who has been a very active activist in Sri Lanka, both on the ground and in courts, will tell us about the experience in Sri Lanka, both in relation to plastic waste and to the recent catastrophe of the spillage of Noodle. We'll then hear a message from the permanent representative of Peru to the UN. I believe the message is also recorded because Senora Alfaro Espinosa could not be with us today. We'll then have a brief discussion. We have invited three estimated speakers from the Basel Convention. We'll have Carlos Martin Novella. From the ILO, we'll have Mustafa Kamal Gay, who is the Global Coordinator of Green Job Program at ILO, and Marce Gutierrez Graudins, who is the Executive Director of ASUL and who is the lead author of a recent report on plastics and human rights for UNEP. And so those last three speakers will have a brief presentation introduction, and will then go into discussion. We're hoping to keep as much time as possible for question and answers. We have quite a lot of estimate guests and participants signed on today, so I'm anticipating that there will be questions or comments, and so we'll try to make sure to keep some time for this. And I apologize in advance to the speakers, but I'll try to be as strict as possible with time. And so you might hear me or see messages from me in the chat if you exceed the time that you have. So with no further ado, we will now start this event and hear the opening remark first from His Excellency Ambassador Emilio Izquierdo, who is the permanent representative of Ecuador to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva. If we could have the recording.
I would like to thank Special Rapporteur Marcos Orellana for convening this timely plastics and human rights event. For Ecuador, it's an honor to co-sponsor it with the European Union, and I'm pleased to welcome the panelists and participants. The international community has become aware of the urgent need to work together to find solutions to the growing problem of plastic pollution, one of the three planetary crises, along with climate change and biodiversity loss. Knows that the goal is that plastic products worldwide should be produced, used, and reused in accordance with the life cycle and the circular economy approaches, looking for alternatives that are technically and ecological viable. To the special rapporteur's report, numerous scientific studies have revealed the magnitude of the plastics threat over the past few years, which has had a devastating impact on our planet, wildlife, health, and human rights. Faced with a global challenge, we must act with global responses. In that sense, I would like to highlight that the human rights approach is critical to protecting the interests of individuals and communities, provide legitimate and effective responses to reach sustainable development while advancing economic and social human rights. 2 weeks ago, Ecuador, along Germany, Ghana, and Vietnam, convened the first ministerial conference on marine litter and plastic pollution. Organized with the support of UNEP, the conference reviewed the growing negative impact of plastic pollution and the severe consequences for the environment, human rights, health, tourism, trade, and the sustainable development of communities. More than 1,000 representatives from 140 countries and numerous international organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector participated, and as a result of the deliberations, the main elements of a future agreement were identified. Objectives and goals, concrete commitments to reduce and phase out plastic pollution throughout its life cycle, and financing and capacity building for developing countries. The ministerial declaration that emerged from the conference seeks to build momentum and political will to advance a coherent global strategy to end marine litter and plastic pollution, and also supports the need to take decisive steps towards the establishment of an intergovernmental negotiating committee on marine litter and plastic pollution at UNEA 5.2 to negotiate a global agreement with ambitious goals. Finding agreement on the matter must be elevated to the top of the global policy-making agenda. Therefore, I invite all countries to endorse the ministerial declaration before October 15th. Dialogue should lead us to explore how we can contribute to national and global efforts to address plastic pollution, including through the global agreement. On behalf of Ecuador, I renew my gratitude for this opportunity to share our views on this historic task ahead of us. We wish you a constructive and fruitful dialogue. Thank you very much.
So with thanks and gratefulness to the government of Ecuador, both for their participation today and for the groundwork that they've been doing along the past years in trying to push this issue forward. Thank you very much. We'll now go on with a preliminary remark from His Excellency Ambassador Thomas Wagner, who's the Deputy Permanent Representative of the EU to the UN in Geneva. So if we could have the video, please.
I would like to thank Mr. Oranella, Special Rapporteur on Toxic Waste and Human Rights, for the invitation to this timely event on plastics and human rights, which is a very pressing issue and high on the EU's agenda. I would like to extend my thanks also to the organizers of this event, which is taking place within the framework of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues and Geneva Toxic Free Talks, for making this happen. In the opening statement at the 48th session, the UN High Commissioner Madame Bachelet strongly reminded us of the unsustainable pace of pollution that was generating premature deaths and had devastating impacts on human rights, and that pollution, together with climate change, acts as a threat multiplier and is expected to constitute the single greatest challenge to human rights in our era. Mr. Special Rapporteur, your recent report on the stages of the plastic cycle and the impact on human rights, which will be presented to the UN General Assembly this autumn, echoed Madame Bachelet's call and stressed the need to find a human rights-based solution to address the global plastics problem. Indeed, the problem of plastics affects a wide range of human rights, as your report clearly highlighted. For instance, the extractions of raw materials and their use in the production of plastics contaminate the environment. The chronic exposure of human beings to hazardous substances released into the environment are further associated with the origin of several human diseases and therefore impact upon human rights, including the right to life, health, or food, the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and the right to safe drinking water and sanitation. People in vulnerable situations are usually disproportionately affected by the impact of hazardous substances in plastics, especially workers. The chronic exposure of workers throughout the whole plastic cycles, from manufacturing chemicals to recycling, manual handling, and ultimately machinery noise, undermine the right to safe and healthy working conditions. Moreover, plastic break down into microplastics that accumulate and poison food consumed by people, affecting the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of health and an adequate standard of living for his or her overall well-being. The European Union has been a front-runner in addressing this grave problem within our own territory and beyond. Inside the EU, the revised EU Drinking Water Directive, which entered in force in January this year, has sent a strong message of our commitment to access to safe water for all. In April 2018, the European Commission's Director General for Environment submitted a list of our practices that set standards for the protection of health and safety, in particular economic sectors and against specific risks. These sectors include, amongst many others, ship recycling and electrical and electronic equipment waste management, which include dealing with dangerous substances and mixtures that these industries produce. It is then imperative that victims of exposure to hazardous substances find adequate access to remedies for damages caused and or arising from the impact of plastics on human rights. Such measures are foreseen in the provision of the EU treaties and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and EU legislation. For instance, the EU Victims' Rights Directive creates minimum standards to ensure that victims of crimes committed in the EU can effectively participate in criminal proceedings, irrespective of the victim's nationality or resident status. The Brussels I regulation regulates the international jurisdiction of member states' courts in cross-border cases, and the Rome II regulation establishes the applicable law for tort cases, including torts relating to human rights. Outside the EU, we see that the current international legal framework governing plastic pollution is fragmented and insufficient. For this reason, in multilateral fora, the European Union and its member states lead efforts towards a global agreement on plastics. We should seize this political momentum, widen cross-regional support, and achieve an ambitious mandate at the 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly in February next year 2022, based on a human rights-based approach. The flow of plastics is projected to increase in the coming years, with devastating effects for our planet and human rights, and a coordinated and enhanced global action needs to take place to change the current trends and drastically reduce plastics. Mr. Special Rapporteur, I am confident that your work will greatly contribute to raising continued awareness on this crucial issue whilst highlighting its human rights implications. We look forward to our continued cooperation with your mandate and wish you a successful and fruitful discussion. I thank you.
So thanking also the governments of the European Union for their work on this issue of plastic and for their support of the mandate. I will now, with no further delay, give the floor to Dr. Marcos Orellana, who is the Special Rapporteur on the impacts of toxic substances and waste on the enjoyment of human rights. Marcos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, for giving me the floor. I also wish to thank Ambassador Izquierdo from Ecuador and Ambassador Wagner from the European Union for their opening remarks, as well as the partners that have co-convened this event. On Tuesday, a couple of days ago, in the interactive dialogue before the Human Rights Council, I had the opportunity to present my report on the right to science in the toxics context. And I opened that referring to the situation on disinformation, on plastics recycling, labeling it as an example of a direct attack, a concerted attack against the right to science. This disinformation example can be seen because recycling of plastics as a message has been pushed through not by the environmental groups interested in sustainability, for example, but by the plastics industry. And this in full knowledge that there is no capacity to handle the growing volumes of plastic waste around the world, that in actuality, less than 10% of plastics are recycled, and that recycling of plastics is dangerous. It concentrates toxic additives that are added to plastics. So it diverts attention. The messaging of recycling of plastics delay tactics. It puts the frame of individual responsibility instead of plastic regulations. On Tuesdays, I was also talking about the Formosa Plastics project in the state of Louisiana in the United States, and the impacts that it was expected to have in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And so we see that the connection between disinformation, plastics, and local communities in relation to human rights. There's no doubt we're facing a global plastics crisis. Large-scale manufacturing of plastic started around 1950s in the order of 2 million tons a year. Today, the annual production hovers around 415 million tons and is increasing. It's projected to quadruple by 2050, and that has led analysts and commentators to point out that by then, in 2050, there will be more plastics than fish in the ocean. Now, well, there are a few companies that produce most polymers, 20 by some accounts. Supply chains and consumption involve most, if not all, countries of the world, thus making this issue an issue of global significance. Now, despite the magnitude of the plastics crisis, it can be tackled, but for it to be effective, all key dimensions need to be addressed: trade, technology, biodiversity, and no doubt human rights. Human rights are implicated in every stage of the cycle of plastics, whether it's extraction of raw materials for the feedstocks and impacts of oil spills on indigenous people's lands, or whether it's manufacturing of plastics and the release of dangerous, hazardous substances that contaminate fence-lined communities around petrochemical plants. Or transport, as we've seen recently with a case study I believe will be addressed further on in the program of the Express Pearl off coasts of Sri Lanka. And no doubt use, the impact of toxic additives in plastics that leach and contaminate people that use plastics products. Waste has, of course, received the most attention. The growing problem of waste. Burning creates its own set of issues. Landfilling leaches to the environment. Dumping is a very clear problem that is associated with waste. Now, in addition to human rights being implicated in every stage of the plastic cycle, there's also the question of human rights impacts of toxic additives in plastics and microplastics. By some accounts, 10,000 chemicals are added to plastics to achieve their properties. Now, several of these chemicals, they are hazardous, persistent organic pollutants, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so the question of plastics is not just waste volume, but the toxic additives in them. And as has been mentioned earlier by Ambassador Wagner, the impacts of all of this bear disproportionately on groups in vulnerable situations. Indigenous peoples, I've mentioned before, workers in plastic facilities, for example, or workers as waste pickers in the treatment of management of waste. There's issues of contaminants in plastics that affect children, that being toys or milk bottles and the like. Women are particularly impacted by toxic additives in plastics and also in sanitary products. And all of this is having a severe impact on present and future generations. What world are we leaving for the future? If we look at the current legal and policy framework around the world in order to address plastics, we see fragmentation, whether it's because of the scope of instruments, certain instruments are focused on certain stages, or whether it's because of the regional limitations. So if we look at some examples, the Basel Convention in 2019 adopted amendments to certain annexes to close what was a sham recycling loophole. Implementation is a matter of is a challenge, and so we'll remain tuned to see how countries are actually implementing those amendments. I believe we'll hear more in the program about that as well. The Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants is currently also now debating whether the potential for long-range environmental transport, which is one of the screening criteria for listing a chemical as a persistent organic pollutant, can be satisfied given that plastics carries persistent organic pollutants around the world and in long-range environmental transport. Now, that would be a very important element in dealing with toxic additives, no doubt. Another example is MARPOL, the convention under the International Maritime Organization designed to address pollution from ships. It has an annex concerning garbage and plastics in that, and it bans the discharge or the dumping of garbage in the seas. And that's very welcome. But at the same time, it requires coastal and port states to have facilities for the reception of plastic garbage, and many of these facilities they exist in paper, or they do not have adequate waste management practices. So the plastic ends up in the sea anyway, and it impacts local coastal community. So we see, given this fragmentation, a need for, and also movement, a kind of momentum building towards a new global binding, legally binding agreement that can be comprehensive and that can address plastics in all its stages in order to be effective. In the design of such instrument, and more generally, in the design of a chemically safe circular economy, human rights principles play a very important role, an indispensable role, starting from the right to information. What kind of polymers are being produced? Are they suitable for recycling, for example? Which additives are being added to plastics? These are key elements of information to prevent exposure to hazardous substances and to enable safe design, safe product design. Similarly, public participation is critical at the national level, especially on plastics policy. That's where better solutions come in. Access to justice, access to remedies is a cornerstone principle of human rights law and policy. Coastal communities should not be left paying the bill of the plastics pollution in their beaches. Just transition is also acquiring greater prominence in that states need to be able to support groups in vulnerable situations, especially those that may be impacted by response measures. Other human rights principles where human rights and environment dialogue come together include prevention, precaution, polluter-based principle. That's where the assessment of potential solutions is so important. Bioplastics, for example, has been put forward as a solution, but bioplastics, many of them have similar toxic additives as do plastics. So what is the environmental and health impact of bioplastics? Similarly, plastics to fuel as a possible solution. Incineration creates its own set of problems, generating dioxins, very dangerous, persistent organic pollutants. So in order to deal with prevention, the issue of product design is critical. The last thing I'll mention on human rights principles for a chemically safe circular economy is on extended producer responsibility, making the point that a number of countries are implementing arrangements to ensure that the cost of dealing with plastic waste is not borne by the public, but by the producer. This also has implications for prevention. Now, there's a transboundary dimension there. Extended producer responsibility across borders would also ensure that the environmental burden is not transferred from producing nations to the global south. Cognizant of time, Mr. Moderator, I will conclude very simply by pointing out that to deal with the global plastic crisis, action is needed at all levels, including at the local level, at the local, national, regional, and global levels. And addressing human rights impacts is necessary in each of those stages, in each of the stages of the plastic cycle. Adopting a rights-based approach to response measures and to a globally legally binding instrument is key for effective and legitimate solutions. As mentioned earlier, I will be presenting elements of this debate and my report on plastics and human rights to the third committee of the General Assembly in a few weeks, and so we'll remain tuned for that debate as well as for the debates at the UN Environmental Assembly 5.2 in February in Nairobi, where it is expected that action will catalyze to move this issue forward. Thank you very much. David, back to you.
Thank you very much, Marcos, for this very holistic and it's quite a feat to summarize in only 10 minutes the full report with the amount of information that is available and also the amount of work that went into the report. So thank you very much, and I very much hope that we'll have a chance and that we'll have interesting discussions and questions coming up at the end of this event. Our next two speakers will really take the presentation that we've just had to the next level. Our next speaker will illustrate a number of points that were raised by the special rapporteur, showing what exactly is happening on the ground, both in terms of impact as well in terms of actions that can be taken by civil society, governments, and other stakeholders. And the following speaker, Her Excellency Ambassador Silvia Elena Alfaro Espinosa from Peru, will present the initiative, the resolution that will be tabled to this 5.2 session of the UNEA in February that is expected to catalyze actions around this. So first, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Imanta Wintanaj. Very welcome to this event. I believe you will be the one switching your slides yourself. So you have the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I haven't used my WebEx before. If you can put my slides, that will be great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for Ambassador Emilio and all of you for organizing and inviting me. Plastic is a byproduct of the fossil industry. So China produced largest quantity of plastics, nearly 60 million tons, followed by the United States, 38 million, etc. So packaging is the dominant use of primary plastics, with 42% plastics entering the use phase. Asia has become the dumping ground between 2016 and 2018. 10 countries within the ASEAN saw plastic waste imports grow a staggering 100% In 2019, CJ filed the legal action on 263 containers filled with forced consumer waste, carpets, plastics, and other mixed waste imported from to Sri Lanka in around 2017 from United Kingdom. So corporation justified this importation for value addition, but actually they are good for scrap and also for incineration. In response to the Center for Environmental Justice lawsuit demanding the repatriation, the court ordered them to repatriate them to the origin. So there's a similar experience comes from Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. In the most recent Express Pearl ship disaster, 1,680 metric tons of plastic noodles, 9,700 metric tons of epoxy resins, and 81 hazardous chemical containers were on board in this ship. At least 85 billion high-density polyethylene and low-density polyethylene noodles spilled to the sea. About 700 kilometers of the coast was affected, and over 16,000 fishermen and their families were affected. Only 40% may have been collected, according to the Minister of Environment. Rest will remain in the ocean for the next 500 to 1,000 years and travel from Sri Lanka to Indian coast and Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Microplastics resulting from the burnt contaminated plastic is a serious issue. There's a local inventor, CRS Holdings, who have invented a machine to separate noodles and microplastics, sludge, and put back clean sand. So none other equipments were available at the time. So, but the International Tank Owners Pollution Federation is trying to block this by asking separate only plastic about 3 millimeter and trying to hide the noodle pollution and the microplastic pollution so that the damage claim can be reduced. So both issues show how the big businesses are involved in human rights violations related to the plastics. The adverse effects of plastics throughout its life cycle on human health, the environment, food security, and safety infringe on our fundamental rights. Plastic waste trade is a form of waste colonialism and environmental injustice and perpetuates violation of human rights. Thus, we demand to immediately implement the Basel Convention Plastic Amendment. We call the shipping company, Express Feeders, and the insurer P&I Club to be accountable for the Express Pearl chemical ship disaster. We acknowledge the role of the Ambassador Emilio as the chair of the open-ended intergovernmental working group on the international legally binding instruments on transnational cooperation and other business enterprises with respect to the human rights. And we call a strong binding instrument on multinational enterprises and need the law at the national level to implement the same. So we don't have the adequate laws at the local level. So we have to deal with these issues at the national level as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Hemanta, for this very insightful and, I must say, quite heartbreaking presentation, though I suspect that some people in the audience didn't learn that much because this is unfortunately already well known. But I also thank you very much for outlining the possible ways forward and for demands that arise from civil society around the world. One of your demands is in fact related to the development of an international instrument that now over 120 countries have subscribed to the idea and are supporting the creation of an intergovernmental negotiation committee at the upcoming session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. And thankfully, we're very lucky to have a message from the permanent representative of Peru, Her Excellency Ambassador Silvia Elena Alfaro Espinosa, who will also introduce the initiatives that are carried by the governments of Peru and Rwanda for the creation of such an international negotiation committee. So, Harvey, if I could ask you please to move on now to the recording from Her Excellency. Thank you very much.
Dear friends, thanks to the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Ecuador and the European Union for organizing this event. Peru confirms its commitment to promote awareness on plastic pollution as a global environmental concern. Peru is a very vulnerable country to the problem of plastic pollution. We have more than 3,000 kilometers of coastal extension facing the Pacific Ocean with a very particular high biodiversity. Our connection with the ocean and its sustainable use and conservation is ancient. The fishing activity in the Peruvian Sea started as early as 5,000 years ago, when the people of Caral, the oldest city in the Americas, practiced fish and mollusk catching using cotton fishing nets, hooks and boats, including the caballito de totora. Fish and seafood are part of the traditional diet, and it is one of the pillars of the world recognition of Peruvian gastronomy. At present, an important share of our national incomes come from fisheries. However, plastics harm the wildlife, health, fisheries, tourism, recreation activities, and threaten marine ecosystems. It also has a direct impact on a broad range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, science, housing, and a healthy environment. Peru has taken several measures to address the problem, including a roadmap for the integral management of plastic to prevent the degradation of marine ecosystems. But we face a transboundary problem. Therefore, we cannot address this global problem alone. Actions at the national level have to be strengthened with a coordinated global solution involving governments, civil society, academia, the private sector, and the consumers. Cooperation and coordination on a global scale are essential to address the transboundary problem of plastic pollution. We welcome the discussions that started in different settings around a potential global instrument on marine litter and plastic pollution, in particular the latest ministerial conference held here in Geneva at the beginning of the month. A global instrument should promote national action plans to prevent, reduce, and mitigate or remediate plastic pollution, tailored to local and national circumstances and the characteristics of specific sectors, and support the development and implementation of regional action plans by establishing common objectives, targets, and mandatory commitments. The reporting and monitoring work should have a role since it is crucial to develop evidence-based plans. This instrument should also promote financial and technical assistance for all this. Multi-stakeholders engagement is crucial. The scientific community, businesses and industry, investors, insurances and development banks, donors and civil society all should work together with governments to promote scientific research, to develop innovative solutions to mitigate the impacts of marine litter and plastic pollution. The moment has come to take concrete actions, in particular at the next resumed session of the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly, the UNEA 5.2, in February 2022. To achieve a commitment to reduce the generation of plastic waste in general, as well as increase the use of recycled material in all production activities, thereby supporting the development of a circular economy. Peru, together with Rwanda and the support of several other countries from different regions, we have circulated a draft resolution on this matter. This initiative builds upon previous resolutions of the UNEA and is put forward under the firm conviction that greater international measures are needed. The main purpose of the resolution is to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee, INC, and establish an open mandate for negotiations to develop a new legally binding global instrument. This new legally binding instrument should be based on a comprehensive approach to prevent and reduce plastic pollution in the environment, including microplastics, by promoting a circular economy and addressing the full life cycle of plastics, from production, consumption, and design to waste prevention, management, and treatment. The key elements in this future instrument should be the shared objectives, reporting and monitoring aspects, national action plans and commitments, scientific and technical support, financial and technical assistance. Peru and the co-sponsors of the resolution look forward to getting as much support as possible for this important resolution. Our delegation will continue to engage all relevant stakeholders in an open, transparent, and participatory, and of course, inclusive manner for this purpose. Thank you very much.
With deep thanks to the government of Peru and to Ambassador Alfaro Espinosa, I think it was really interesting. Those last two presentations were extremely interesting, as they really shed light on the width of the issue that we're dealing with, as well as with the scope of initiatives that were already taken. And there's also one thing in this discussion that I find extremely interesting and relevant and extremely actual, I would say, is how we can see through this question of plastic, we can see different segments of the international community, from the human rights community, from the environment community, but similar things exist in the trade community and others, coming together and really trying to hone in and developing the tools that will give us a chance to actually address this particular crisis. In that respect, we'll now hear from three discussants. We'll hear from Carlos Martin Novella, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the BRS Convention, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention, which were already mentioned by a previous speaker. We'll also hear from Mustafa Kamal Gay, who is the Global Coordinator for the Green Job Program of the ILO, which is, of course, also very relevant, because as we are considering and discussing a transition to a different kind of economy, to a safe circular economy, there's been a lot of talks of circular economy. I think reading the report from the Special Rapporteur, everybody will agree that it's not only about circular economy, it's about being safe and respecting health, a safe economy. And as we're doing this transition, there are very important major questions relating to the workforce and how green job can be supported and guaranteed through this transition. And we'll then hear from Marce Gutierrez Graudins, who's the Executive Director of Azul, an NGO based in Mexico, who has also been doing a lot of work together with UNEP on these particular issues. So with no further ado, I will now give the floor 5 minutes to each of the three discussants. Carlos, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David. Excellencies, dear Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Marcos Orellana, nice to see you again. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Allow me first to express my appreciation for inviting me to participate in this event on behalf of the Secretariats of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions on Chemicals and Waste, three multilateral environmental agreements sharing the common objectives of protecting the environment and human health against the adverse effects of hazardous chemicals and wastes. Through such objectives, the BRS conventions are unquestionably linked to and to contribute to protecting human rights, notably the right to life, to health, to a healthy environment, among many others. I would like to, first of all, also congratulate the Special Rapporteur for convening this event. It's very, very timely, and for Ecuador and the European Union for co-sponsoring it. I would also like to congratulate the Special Rapporteur on the implications for human rights on the environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and waste for his report on the right to science, as presented this week to the Human Rights Council 48 sessions. And science-based decision-making is key under the BRS conventions and means that decisions taken by the governing bodies, the Conference of the Parties, are and should be underpinned by sound scientific assessments. Furthermore, I thank the Special Rapporteur for introducing to us his annual report to the United Nations General Assembly on the stage of the plastic cycle and their impacts on human rights. Really, the presentation, Marcos, earlier this morning has been excellent, and very little I can say in addition to that. Such report comes at a critical moment as your planet is facing a major global plastic pollution crisis, calling the attention of various international fora and processes, yet exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic that has undeniably intensified not only our dependence on plastics, but also the challenges in ensuring the environmentally sound management of plastics waste, and in particular, the challenges faced by the most vulnerable, the children, women, the poor, disabled, health workers, etc., and thus hampering the implementation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development Goals by us all. In the response to such a global plastic pandemic, the landmark Basel Convention Plastic Waste Amendment, as adopted by the Conference of the Parties in 2019, is already an excellent initiative to build upon. It is the first and only ambitious action under a legally binding instrument aiming at effectively tackling the environmental and health harmful consequences posed by plastic waste so far. As a result, the amendments may contribute to a more efficient protect, respect, fulfill, and remedy a series of fundamental human rights, whether civil or political, or social and economic. The right to life, the right to health, and the right to clean water and sanitation. In particular, those are the most vulnerable individuals, the enjoyment of which by everyone and everywhere on this planet may seriously be impacted by this plastic tsunami. To that end, the Plastic Convention Plastic Waste Amendment indeed required that parties step up their efforts to prevent and minimize the generation of plastic waste, to minimize and control transboundary movements of plastic waste, and to strengthen their capabilities for environmentally sound management of plastic waste. Thanks to the generous financial support from our donors, Norway, Switzerland, the European Union, among others, dozens of countries around the world are now already being supported in their efforts to tackle the plastic waste crisis through the implementation of these amendments related activities, through technical assistance and capacity building activities towards the more accurate implementation of the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Amendments, which became effective already some months ago in January 2021. In connection thereto, the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Partnership also provides a 360-degree forum for governments, international organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector to work hand in hand towards addressing plastic waste as a source of land pollution and marine plastic litter. The PIC procedure, prior informed consent, under the Basel Convention can also be seen as a genuine tool to help in protecting human rights. What more important than the right to know what you are taking and the right to decide if you want it or not. So this is very much linked to the human rights from our point of view. The Basel Convention amendments on plastics constitute a very important step to address the problems posed by plastic waste. But still, much more needs to be done. Under the Basel Convention and the Stockholm Convention, as mentioned before this morning, and several other treaties, without regarding the need for an additional international legal instrument specific to plastics. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, with these few words, I am pleased to have had the opportunity on the occasion of this event to briefly share the PRS perspective, in particular that of the Basel Convention on the enjoyment of human rights and plastics. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to enhancing cooperation and collaboration between our respective organizations in function of our mandates so as to, in the end, better protect human rights on our planet. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for this very interesting point and for reminding or informing everyone in the audience about those great advances in the context of the Basel Convention, which I must say I was quite lucky to participate in and to witness. And beyond the practical elements that these amendments bring and that the Basel Convention brings in supporting the countries better dealing with their hazardous and plastic waste, I think there's also something quite strong to be learned from this movement in the context of the Basel Convention, was to see how swiftly and how strongly did the 187 countries parties to the Basel Convention come together behind an idea. And we know that this amendment was adopted much faster than any amendments that were adopted before. And that really demonstrates an appetite and a momentum to deal with this issue at the global level. And it has been very interesting for me to see how the provisions of these amendments are really being taken forward, and how this momentum that arose in the Basel Convention is now translating in a number of other international organizations, whether it's UNIA, ILO, WTO, UNCTAD, and others. So thank you very much for this presentation. I will now give the floor to Mr. Mustafa Kamal Gay, the Global Coordinator for the Green Job Program at ILO. Mustafa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to express appreciation for associating the International Labour Office to this very important event. Dear participants, excellencies, and dear colleagues, we have been asked to address the question of workers in waste picking and recycling, and how the issues of just transition feature in that. So I would just want to mention that I have been working on this presentation with my esteemed colleague, Simel Asim, who is the head of the cooperatives unit at the International Labour Office, but who unfortunately couldn't join us for this session today. Now, in terms of the context, I would like to start by saying that there are a lot of people who work in waste picking and collection, including plastic waste. And this is, I am going to move to my next slide. And this is a significant number of people from around the world. We have estimated that there are between 15 to 20 million people who are in this activity, but working in what we refer to as the informal economy. There are about 5 million workers in the formal economy, as of ILO estimates in 2013. As we have heard from the special rapporteur, China being the leading country in production of plastic as an industry, we also see that there is a large number of people in informal recycling in China, and that's the same in the case of Brazil. It is also estimated that waste pickers collect an important part of waste in low-income countries. So they actually do 50% to the total waste picking. It's also important to note what has been mentioned earlier, that many of those earning a living out of waste and plastic waste collection and recycling are in vulnerable groups. They are women, children, the elderly, the unemployed people, and increasingly migrant workers. Finally, there is a very important gender dimension, which is that there are many female workers in that industry. And if you go by certain region, like in Vientiane in Laos, it's over 50%, and in Cusco in Peru, over 80% by some estimates. And just to say finally that plastic waste is one of the main waste streams in terms of collection and recycling. Now, I would turn to a second point, which I think is also known, but it's still very important to restate that many of those working in this activity are in conditions of work that are characterized by a lot of decent work deficits. see a lot of, I hoping to move to my next slide. So we see a lot of occupational safety and risk issues. There's a lack of social security. We know globally there is a deficit of social security and adequate social security and health insurance, but much more pronounced in this particular area. Low income, weak positions, and also issues of just social perception of workers in this area, social inclusion. So all kinds of abuses and human rights violations, we do find them in those engaged in this activity. Now, I wanted to mention that we know many of the problems. And I think it's now time, as there is a debate on a global regulatory framework on plastic, which is taking us in the direction of looking for solutions, that when it comes to decent work, we also turn our attention towards looking for solutions. And that's in this context that I wanted to focus a little on what we see the reality of people, women and men working in this area with decent work deficits, and the need to find how to help them better organize. And this notion of social solidarity economy is emerging as one of the possible pathways to do that. So broadly, what we refer to as social solidarity economy is about enterprises and organizations that deliver goods, services, and knowledge, but in addition to doing that, pursue social and other economic objectives of interest to society at large. Now, by organizing in cooperatives, for example, we see that there is a value for workers to improve working conditions, to have some form of collective bargaining, to be able to engage in public policy. And in the larger presentation I provided to GAIN Network Secretariat, I have provided some examples of what we see as some promising experiences around the world towards that direction of organizing activities and workers in that in this area in terms of social solidarity economy, cooperatives, and enterprises of similar nature. Now, I want to turn to a last part of my presentation, I think. So I was just talking about the benefits of organizing, but then turn to the part of the solutions, which is now more on the normative frameworks. The ILO being a normative organization, our constituents, our tripartite constituents made of representatives of governments, workers, and employers have put forward a number of instruments that could already be part of the solution, including the debate on a global regulatory frameworks. I would just want to refer to three of them. One is the ILO recommendation on the promotion of cooperatives, which is a 2002 recommendation, but very important. The second one is the recommendation 204 of 2015 on the informality to formal economy, which is also an important normative framework. And then the third, which is not a labor standards, but a set of guidelines that come from tripartite consensus, which is the ILO guideline for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. We think that these are all important elements that could play a role in the direction of solutions, including through a normative, global normative framework. I wanted to end by saying that the 110th session of the International Labour Conference taking place next year will have a general discussion on the theme of a social solidarity economy for a human-centered future of work. And we think this could be going towards UNEA, an important part of this agenda, because it could also shape a lot of the elements I've spoken about, but in a broader context with a tripartite engagement. And we hope that could be contributing to this agenda. So I would stop here and again appreciate very much the opportunity to have the World of Work be part of this important agenda, and to say that we in the office stand ready to work, keep in the engagement, including through the upcoming UNEA process. And I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for this also very insightful presentation. I am going to move us along now and give the floor to Senora Marce Gutierrez Graudins, who will talk to the frame of the report and will put our reflection also and refocus our reflection in the context of SDGs. And I see that we're starting to get questions and comments in the chat. Thank you very much for this. I encourage you to keep on writing them. We will start addressing them as soon as the next speaker has made her presentation. Thank you very much. Marce, the floor is yours.
Yes. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you to the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Orellana, as well as the organizers. And thank you to the governments of Ecuador and European Union for co-sponsoring this. It is hard to add much more here because we've had a very fruitful and interesting discussion. And I think that it's good to have discuss plastic pollution in this framework. I will add to this in the frame of our report that we recently published earlier this year with the UNEP, specifically on looking at how plastic pollution impedes the full and timely achievement of all the Sustainable Development Goals. When we looked at this, for us, Azul, coming from a marine conservation standpoint, is something that we had heard before. You know, plastic is an issue that we deal with, but at the same time, in marine conservation, something we need to start looking at is all the problems that it causes. You know, for us, we start looking at the charismatic animals that have the problems downstream, right? So we think about plastic pollution only as that turtle, not only, but mainly as this turtle with the problems in the plastic, right? But the problem is that by the time that the fauna and, let's say, this turtle has been impacted, plastic pollution has left you know, a whole host of problems in its wake. Current efforts, which are just managing, for the most part, managing and decreasing plastic pollution, are really inadequate to address the whole of these problems. You know, when we look at this issue, we need to look at a global frame, and this is why it's important and exciting to see conversations like this, because we have seen microplastics now found from the Arctic to Antarctica, from all the ocean basins, and in rainwater in Colorado. And so as we think about this, plastic production, use, pollution, and the processes that generate impact populations around the world and the resources they deserve, and especially impact vulnerable populations in an inordinate amount. One of the things that we were looking at specifically into the goals, we looked at all the SDG goals, all the Sustainable Development Goals, and we found that there was a problem, again, in the achievement in all of these through one of the things that were happening in this life cycle. I will speak today about SDG 3, the Sustainable Goal 3, which is the good health and well-being. And so for this, we were looking at production and source production. And well, as we know, plastics come from hydrocarbons, and their extraction can be highly damaging to a polluting process. Here in the US, it is unfortunate that we have vulnerable communities bear the brunt of this extraction and production. And so as we were looking at this report, which is called Neglected, and it was published in April, as we were looking at this report to try to find a specific concrete example, one of the issues that we found was that plastics are so pervasive in our environment and in our use that there was one specific concern that we could isolate to this and find that direct link, because there were so many places that we were being affected by it. The one thing, unfortunately, that we were seeing, and this is a well-known issue. Again, I think this is sometimes new to some of us, but as somebody talked about before, this is something, an issue that communities around the world have been dealing with for many years now. And so it's important that we understand that while this framing and this conversation may be new to some circles, it is not a new problem, and it's something people have been dealing for a long time. For us, again, you know, we looked at the source and the production. And here in the US, what we found obviously is that, you know, hydrocarbons are what drives plastic pollution. And in one case, we were looking at, you know, the fact that the production itself in a specific place, which is Reserve, Louisiana, very well known in this whole area for the problems that they have to deal with. And in that area, we have an impact to local residents where the risk of cancer is 50% national average, which is the highest in the US, and also, by the way, happens to be the only manufacturing plant in the US for chloroprene, which then is used for neoprene, which is what you use sometimes in, let's say, wetsuits. And it was the only manufacturing plant in the US, and so also happens to be the only place that has this elevated risk of cancer at that level. So now we have a problem where we're looking at plastic is directly impacting the good health, the well-being of people, that fuel extraction, refining, transportation, feedstock, plastic production impacts the health population living in the vicinity of such facilities. And again, as I mentioned before, the folks that are having to that live next to these vicinities that are sometimes unable to either don't have the political power yet or haven't been used the political power to impact the movement of these places, to impede the location there, or to move themselves out, are people that have the least political power. And that's what we're looking at in terms of, like, when we talk about environmental justice, who are these people that are having to deal with things? So I think it's important that as we look at this, we look at all these impacts. I'm sure that there's many other health impacts around the world that we probably are just starting to learn, and that we really include them, and we talk about plastic pollution and really these efforts from that viewpoint, because that's really what needs to guide our concern and our work, and why it's so important and so exciting to see the work of an effort to do you know, plastics treaty and legally binding work at a global level, because obviously the impacts of this do not stay localized and do not stay in just these areas. And so for this matter, we're excited to participate in this and continue to support this work. And I'm open to questions here.
Well, thank you very, very much, Marce, and thank you very much to all our panelists today. Now we have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Well, I invite you all to put in your questions to the panelists or comments into the chat. We already received a comment and a question thanking the panelists for the presentation, but also noting the imbalance, the gender imbalance on the panel, as well as the lack of representation for most impacted communities. I think this is quite a good point. I'm afraid I don't have. I'm not going to start trying to provide excuses. There really aren't. What I can say is that I know that for the actual official presentation of the report by the Special Rapporteur to the General Assembly, a number of side events are being provided, and we are currently working with the organizer trying to ensure that representative of impacted communities will be given the chance to take the floor and to have maybe a little more balanced panel. I don't want to mobilize the floor. I don't think we've received any questions so far. Maybe until we get questions, I could turn the floor back to our panelists and wonder and ask you if you had any additional comments or follow-up that you would want to pick up based on what other speakers have been saying. Maybe I can start with you, Marcos. I don't know if you wanted to add anything or maybe, again, follow up on some of the other presentations. Other speakers, please feel free to just take the floor when Marcos is done. I don't intend to give you the floor one after the other to at least leave the conversation go in a slightly more organic way. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the panelists and commentators for their observations. I have a couple of reactions that I wish to share. Carlos spoke about the efforts at implementation and how the Basel was working with countries at the national level for the implementation of the 2019 amendments, which entered into force recently, as he mentioned. And this is very important and very welcome. I want to recall that one of my predecessors, in fact, the first special rapporteur on toxics and human rights more than 25 years ago now, in her first report, Ms. Fatma Sorosentini pointed out how sham recycling could lead to the environmental injustices and human rights violations associated with hazardous substances. And here we are, more than 2 decades later, closing those loops. I also want to comment on what Mr. Gay mentioned about overlapping vulnerabilities. I think this is a very important point. He mentioned, for example, children and waste pickers. This is something that is addressed in the report that I'm presenting to the GA, and it points out the importance of just transition provisions to be included in any response measures at all levels, and also at the global level. This is something that has acquired some level of visibility in the climate space. I'll come back to the climate space in a moment, and it touches upon an element of disinformation that I also mentioned on Tuesday, the issue of woke washing. So greenwashing, whitewashing, woke washing. So the tactic of expressing sympathy, even conducting advocacy for groups in vulnerable situation, and yet continue to maintain policies or actions that harm those exact same groups. We see that in the design of certain international agreements. We see that also at the national level. There's a great risk there, and so that's something that I wish to comment on. And yet another comment, echoing what Ambassador Izquierdo mentioned, that global challenges call for global solutions. It resonates with what Ambassador Alfaro Espinosa said about the need for coordination and cooperation at the global scale. This brings in the question of what elements of design for a successful agreement. There are a couple of comments that I could mention here. One is means of implementation. This has been mentioned, international cooperation. The cost, the sheer cost of setting up waste collection facilities for a circular economy, and as you mentioned, David, a chemically safe circular economy, are astounding. There's an element here, there's a dimension for common but differentiated responsibilities. There may be nuances that are relevant in contrast with other spheres of environmental policy making, in that historical responsibilities, there may be an angle of discussion there, but it's also a question of access to technology and access to capacity that then allow for international cooperation. That's one element of design, and certainly another is on human rights in a rights-based approach. I mentioned this in my presentation. I'll be looking very carefully and very enthusiastically to see how Peru manages to navigate these waters on human rights in the resolution that Ambassador Alfaro mentioned. It is going to be tabling at the 5th session of the UN Environmental Assembly. We should recall that Peru, in the context of the Independent Association of Latin American Countries, worked very hard to get human rights incorporated into the Paris Agreement, very hard and very successfully. There are elements there that concern objectives of the agreement, and the Paris Agreement could be a model. The last point I'll mention, and also cognizant of time, is on national action plans. Because national action plans, as has been mentioned, can provide very good tools for flexibility, for tailored approaches, not one size fits all. And at the same time, then echoing here again, Ambassador Alfaro, binding commitments, how to be sure that these national action plans actually reach objectives and can be made enforceable. This is an area where climate change and human rights have also come together, where national courts are employing human rights guarantees in order to make climate commitments meaningful and enforceable, and enforce action at the governmental level for climate movement. So that's an area that also holds a lot of promise by way of design for an effective regime, national action plans. So all of that goes into highlighting the human face of the plastics crisis. Thank you, David. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. There are a couple of other questions that came up. Before I pass them on to our panelists, I do want to add something in response to the question that was raised before about better representation and participation of various communities in those international processes that should lead to the designing of a solution. There are a number of processes and mechanisms through which those communities can also take active part in the discussion. There are the major groups within UNEP who are quite active in supporting the countries and in pushing the ambition forward in relation to the decision to be adopted at UNEA 5.2. There are also a number of coordination places and groups that try to bring together voices of workers, of impacted communities, of people of color, of women, of indigenous people to the table and to engage in this particular process. If there are any specific questions on how different individuals or different groups can actively take part in these processes, I invite you to write directly to me. I don't think this now is the right place to have this discussion. We're not going to start listing the different mechanisms, but please, Catherine, feel free to reach out to me directly or through the organizers, and I'll be happy to put you in touch with all of the possibilities and options for greater engagement of impacted community. Now, moving on, there is a very interesting question that is asked by Mr. Yves Lador. It is mostly directed to you, Marcos, but maybe other panelists would also have ideas in that respect. And the question is, how do you see this excellent reports to be used in the elaboration of the new instrument? And you've already highlighted a few pathways through which this could be used for the designing of the future treaty or a future solution, whatever it ends up being. But I'm curious if you had any other additional specific insight on how the reports is to be used and how everyone in the audience and elsewhere could make use of the report to support and to push forward the arguments that that you outline in the report.
Thank you, David. So very quickly, cognizant of time, I would point to two things. One is that the report is a tool that is now out there for various actors to use. In thinking and reflecting on the experience of the incorporation of human rights language explicitly into the Paris Agreement on climate change, for example, that came about as a result of special rapporteurs weighing in, no doubt, civil society running with advocacy and presenting case studies and implications, key countries taking the rights-based approach as an element of negotiation, international organizations also pointing out to the importance of the values and the tools offered by the human rights field. So there's a range of actors that made that a success, and that is an important challenge here as well, for various actors to be able to run with the rights-based approach and inject the human rights dimension into a new plastics agreement. And secondly, and much more succinctly, the narrative, the realization that these plastics issues are not just technical and technology, and they involve a human dimension that needs to be addressed in order for the agreement to be effective and legitimate, so that solutions do not come at the expense of those most vulnerable in society, and the objectives can be reached. And that narrative is very powerful, it's indispensable, I would argue, and it is one of the key elements that can be used so that the report influences any legally binding agreement at the global level on plastics. Back to you, David. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marco. So, and thank you to all panelists. We're getting close to the end of this very interesting event. Before we close, I would like to go back to all of our panelists and give them the possibility to give us one concluding word, either words of encouragement looking forward, something in response to some of the things that have been said before. We don't have that much time, so those would be concluding words. I would ask you to try to keep it relatively short, but I want to make sure that you'll have a chance to further address our participants. Marce, would you like to go first?
Thank you for the invitation. I think what's encouraging here today is, again, having a people-centered effort and see that being the driving force for this. Obviously, the work is to make sure that all people and the people that are most impacted lead the way, but I'm encouraged by this work and the guiding of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marce. Mustafa?
Thank you. I just wanted to thank the special reporter for a very comprehensive report, and to the permanent missions of Ecuador and the European Union for leading this, and also to Peru and Rwanda for their leadership on the resolution. And to just say that so the International Labour Office, we look forward to engaging with our tripartite constituents in this process. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Carlos?
Thank you, David. Yeah, we have been talking a bit today about developing legal frameworks, about the importance of capacity building, implementation at national level. Indeed, there are two things that we have not been talking that is very important to have in mind. One is compliance, so how you ensure the treaties are followed. And secondly, enforcement. In this context, I want to recognize the excellent collaboration that we are having with the World Customs Organization and with Interpol in ensuring the implementation of the plastic amendments to the Basel Convention. So when looking at developing new instruments, look also at how these instruments are going to be implemented and enforced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Unfortunately, we have, I know that we have representative of the countries of both Ecuador, the European Union, and Peru also in the room, but because of arrangement, they were not given participants' right, speakers' right, when we set up the whole meeting. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, I could not give you the floor for a last word. But really, your participation and support for all of this was greatly appreciated. So I will now move to Hemanta.
Thank you very much for the special rapporteur for bringing this report. I think that's excellent need at the moment. So we are suffering from lack of legislations in our own countries. I think without having the international directions, it is very hard to bring the national legislations. We are talking about many different approaches, and also there are a lot of excuses coming from the business sector as well as the users and various other sectors. So we really need some various directions. I think the national legislations is very, very important. I think it won't happen without having the international agreements, legislations, etc. So I think this will lead to develop some sort of legislation at the national level. I think that's the way so we can deal with this very important issue. But at the same time, again, I want to reiterate that the pollution from this express pearl is a serious issue, and we don't think that we can collect all these plastic noodles and other chemicals just spilled to the ocean and moving in the Indian Ocean. So I think so we really need a lot of support from the international community and the companies to take the full accountability, full responsibility for the damage and pay the compensation, etc. So I think that's an important thing for me to elaborate at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manta, and I think this is a very good concluding point. Also making the link with the value that human rights approaches can have in that respect. We know that there's been quite a lot of theoretical and not so theoretical work developed around the role of human rights approaches into remediation and access to remedies in general. So that only reinforces and strongly reinforces the need to develop this human rights approach in the designing of future solutions and future treaty. So thank you very much. For the last words, Marcos.
Thank you, David. Well, only very briefly to thank once again the co-sponsors of the event, Ecuador and the European Union. Thank all the speakers that shared their insights and perspectives. We can see that the magnitude of the challenge is significant, but we're encouraged that we do have the tools to address it. So we'll keep on pushing on the road to Nairobi, the next session of the UN Environment Assembly, via the New York General Assembly of the UN, and on the road ahead in the design of a new tool to confront this crisis. Thank you, David, for moderating. Thank you to the Geneva Environment Network for making this possible. And I look forward to the next opportunity to continue debating these important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Thank you very much to all of the participants. Giving back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, I would like to give the floor to Diana from the Geneva Environment Network to give us maybe some final words, because it is also largely thanks to her work and support, and through the support of various countries, those that participated today, as well as Norway and Switzerland and others, that this meeting and this discussion was possible. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much for the support. Diana, want to do us the honor to close the meeting?
As Marcos just said, thank you also very much, David, for the moderation of this event. And as you mentioned, indeed, Norway and Switzerland, as co-conveners of the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues, were also supporting this event as the other organizers of these dialogues. Just a few words, in New York, there is an important summit happening today on food. Just bringing to your attention that our colleagues from the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat have prepared some info material that has been shared on social networks about plastic in the food system that you can see now on the screen that my colleague is running for you. So very important plastic in the food system. We will be sharing those on the webpage of the event. I don't know, Marcos, if you just want to add just 2 words before I add something else. The floor is yours. Carlos, sorry. I am mixing Spanish names. I apologize.
Thank you very much, Diana. Well, as we said during the conversation, it's important to involve all the key players in this topic. And being a summit on food systems, what a better place to raise awareness about the impact of plastics when dealing with food and food systems in the world. So we have prepared these scorecards. You are free to use them. There's some Interesting information is one of the 5 of them. They are contrasted and cross-referenced information with scientific journals, so it's not rumors. What I say there is facts. So that shows how the scale of the problem we are facing. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And those slides have been shared on social networks and will also be available on the webpage of this event. With that, we are closing this event, and I just wanted to give an insight of what's coming next. On Monday, we will be discussing nature-based solutions and the oceans, also in the running up to the Oceans conference next year in Lisbon. And we have a few other events in preparation that we will be sharing in due time. And of course, the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues will be, more sessions will be coming up before the next session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, addressing many topics that are addressed within International Geneva. With that, thank you all, and looking forward to engage with our panelists and with you, our audience, in the next weeks and months. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David.